Hello everybody, I'm Tommila. Welcome back to my channel. This is Honda Films, the place where you come to learn about photography and all things RC. Today I'm going to be talking about the exposure triangle and why it is most important and the very first thing you should learn in photography. So let's get to it. For many starting out in photography, the relationship between aperture, shutter speed, and ISO can be very, very confusing. To further that, the terms stop and f-stop are often used interchangeably, but refer to very different things. So in this video, I would like to take some of these mysteries out of these concepts by talking about the exposure triangle and why it is the most important thing to understand for those who are starting out. Please keep in mind that these concepts that I have in this video here are oversimplified to make it easier for beginners to understand, especially when it comes to ISO. Aperture, shutter speed, and ISO make up the three sides of the exposure triangle. They work together to produce a photo that is properly exposed. If one variable changes, at least one of the others must also change to maintain that correct exposure. Understanding what a stop of light is key to understanding the exposure triangle. In photography, a stop refers to doubling or halving the amount of light that makes up the exposure. Each photo that we take requires a certain quantity of light to expose it correctly. Now, adding a stop of light by doubling the exposure will brighten an underexposed image. Decreasing an exposure by one stop, or halving the amount of light, will darken an overexposed image. So how do you add or take away a stop of light? Well, to do this, we need to change the aperture, the shutter speed, and or the ISO. So let's take a look at these things individually. Shutter speed is the length of time that light is allowed to hit the sensor. It is measured in seconds. Shutter speed is probably the easiest out of the exposure triangle sides to understand. To double the amount of light, we need to double the length of exposure. For example, moving from a shutter speed of 1/60 of a second to 1/30 of a second will add one stop of light because the shutter will remain open twice as long. Changing from a shutter speed of 1 second to 1/8 of a second will decrease the exposure by 3 stops. And why is that? Well, from 1 second to 1/2 is one stop, then from 1/2 to 1/4 is another stop. Finally, from 1/4 to 1/8 is further halving the time the shutter remains open, or it's the third stop. Aperture refers to the size of the circular hole that is in the lens that lets in light. The bigger the hole, the more light reaches the sensor. In fact, each time you double the area of that opening, you double the amount of light or increase the exposure by one stop. On the other hand, if you halve the area of the opening, you halve the amount of light hitting the sensor. And you guessed it, that will decrease the exposure by one stop. Now, without getting too technical, an f-stop is a ratio that relates to the size of that opening. So mathematically, it is equal to the focal length of the lens divided by the diameter of the lens. So at first glance, the values of the f-stop and scales can be very, very, very confusing. The numbers don't seem to make any sense. Why do small values correspond to larger openings and vice versa? To understand why large f-stop numbers refer to small openings and small f-stop numbers refer to large openings requires a bit of math. Don't worry, I'll try to keep it simple. So if you take the ratio that I mentioned above, in order to get f-stop, you have to divide focal length and diameter. And to get the diameter, you have to go focal length divided by f-stop. What this means is that for any given focal length, we can calculate the diameter of the aperture by dividing the focal length by the f-stop value. But when you divide a given focal length by a large f-stop number, the result is a small diameter. Therefore, the area of the opening is small. If you divide the same focal length by a small f-stop number, you get a large diameter. And a large diameter means a bigger area and also means more light passing through the opening. Also, it turns out that doubling that area of the opening, the f-stop needs to be divided by that square root of 2, which is I think 1.1 or 1.414. And yeah, 1.114. And that's why f-stops are not nice round numbers. To have the area, the f-stop needs to be multiplied by the square root of 2. You know, who wants to do all that stuff, honestly? The final variable in the exposure triangle is ISO. You can think of ISO as the camera's sensitivity to light, or the sensor's sensitivity to light, although it's more complicated than that. Higher values of ISO mean that the sensor does not need to collect as much light to make a correct exposure, and low ISO values mean that the sensor will have to gather more light to make that exposure. Here's the ISO scale. I'm going to put on the screen here. Like shutter speed, this scale is easy to understand. Doubling the ISO equates to one stop increase in exposure. Having the ISO leads to a reduction of the exposure by one stop. I really hope this video helped you out. It was a long time putting it together. I'm so glad I actually able to out here and just get it done. And I really hope it helped you out.